So looking at our knee joint today, if we talk about it, this knee, it's an area that is, I like this sentence here because it's an area that is greatly influenced by the joints above and below it. You know, your knee can't actually do any frontal plane or transverse plane movement until you've actually bent that joint just a little bit. So a lot of times it is sort of in a locked position, which means that like your rotation ability is coming from either above or below the knee, right? Like you're either rotating at the ankle or you're rotating at the hip, and often the hip. And so if you're bad at both of those things, like if you struggle with those things because like those motions are just difficult due to tight overactive muscles, well, you're going to see like dysfunction in the knee joint. Like that stress is going to travel down or it's going to travel up. So definitely influenced by above it, right? If your feet are flattening, that's going to cause your knees to internally rotate. And then that's if you've got like an internal hip rotation or just a tight hip tightness, that's going to put pressure on the knee as well. I mean, we see like, I don't know if anybody here has cracky knees. You know what I mean by that? Like, you feel like you hear like a lot of popping and like when your knees are moving, which is pretty common. And it can kind of freak people out sometimes. It's not quite as bad. You know, the thing is like, it shouldn't be happening in a neutral knee position. But as long as it doesn't actually like hurt when you're doing squats and things like that, it's actually, you're okay. But if you want that to go away, like that's coming from like tight muscles, primarily tight muscles that are actually in your hip. And so then that's traveling down and pulling your knee out of alignment. So then your patella is basically just rubbing on this soft tissue and you're hearing fluid moving around. Just like when you pop like pop your knuckles or whatever, right? Like that's fluid that you hear, leaving the joint. Fun fact for the day. Here we go. We'll do our weird fun fact for the day. In the first like 2 minutes of today's lesson. Cracking your knuckles. There is no evidence that cracking any of your joints actually leads to arthritis or anything. So if your mom told you that growing up, that is not true. However, it doesn't mean that there is no downside. So what's kind of funny about, it's hard to do long-term research. And so I actually shouldn't say, there's definitely no chance of arthritis, but the only time there was ever like a long-term research done on this, there was a guy who decided to crack only the knuckles on like one side of his hand multiple times per day, and he would never do it on his other hand. So he'd always just do the one side, and he did it for years and years and years, like decades. And eventually, he went and monitored how much arthritis was in his hands. And it turned out he did actually have, like, just to be totally transparent, he actually did have more arthritis in the knuckle cracking hand, but no more than like the difference you would normally see between like a left and a right hand. Like he had like, there was a difference between the two hands, but there's going to be a difference between your two hands as well, because you're just not, you're not going to be perfectly symmetrical. So just to be 100% honest, yes, it was higher, but it was higher by a totally normal margin. But what they did find, or what he did find, was that, in order to crack your knuckles, you kind of have to pull them into like exaggerated ranges of motion. So what that does is that actually overstretches your connective tissue and ligaments, and actually can lead to a loss of grip strength. So that's kind of an interesting little thing. So if you're worried about your grip strength, then don't crack your knuckles. But if you're worried about arthritis, that you don't have to worry about that. There's your weird fun fact for the day. This is not an official thing that I do. I think there's always a weird fun fact. Hey, but by the way, really quickly, class survey. Who in here is like a knuckle cracker like regularly? Do I have anybody who like does this? I'm like notorious for it.
I like to do it just because it sounds fun.
Yeah, I do it all day. Here's the thing, as like a fellow knuckle cracker, can you imagine only doing one hand? I like that, like I go insane. Like it drives me a little crazy when I can get like a pop on my left and I can't get it on my right. I go a little nuts. So like, that scientist, he deserves so many props. He did something I could never do. All right, so let's take a look, at the connective tissue in our knee joint, right? So more fun facts about the knee joint. It's the largest joint in your body in terms of like overall amount of space that can be found in between there. It's a very complex joint. It's actually got a lot of specialized structures in it that aren't necessarily only specific to the knee joint. But if you think about like how most joints are, just connected with a simple ligament and, some cartilage and stuff. And then every now and then you'll see like a fat pad or a bursa, like these other special little materials that are sometimes found within joints. Your knee's got all of them, which is pretty cool. So it's got a lot of really special stuff in it. And primarily it's going to act as a hinge joint, but it does do rotational movements as well. So looking at sort of the epidemiology here, right? Like the diseases or conditions that we often deal with, we're going to see 80 to 100,000 ACL injuries annually. And there's 4 ligaments in the knee that are attaching that knee, but the ACL is definitely the most commonly torn. This is the one that you often hear about. Anybody in here tear their ACL? Anybody? No. I had a small tear on my MCL. What's that, Charlie?
Oh, I was answering your question. I mean, like, no, I haven't.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so it's pretty common. I mean, that's good that nobody in here. I love that. But it's a very, very common injury. You see it in, you watch the NBA, you watch the NFL, like happens a lot. And so we'll be looking at that today and sort of why that happens. This one's the most common simply because of the angle that it's tied at. Like it's the type of movement that results in injury because of the type of movement that we're kind of bad at. So the ACL sort of takes that brunt, but your PCL could get torn. That one's really rare. You'll very rarely see like a PCL tear, but sometimes you'll see an MCL tear. That would happen to me, where it happens basically on the inside part of the leg. And then sometimes you'll see LCL tears, like on the lateral side. And those are a little bit more common too. So approximately 70% of those ACL injuries are non-contact. So that right there, right? Like that's a pretty wild statistic when you think about it. When you think about like how many injuries happen and 70% of them are non-contact. So what that means, non-contact, means that someone was just walking, stepped the wrong way, and their knee should have been able to kind of just deal with these awkward forces, because they maybe stepped in a hole, right? And they're like, oh, and they should have been able to catch themselves, but they just weren't ready for that transverse movement. They weren't ready for that twisting, and they tore like their connective tissue, just like in a lateral ankle sprain, right? Like we aren't, we spend so much time in eversion that when we finally do inversion, we tear the freaking ligaments, So a lot of these ACL injuries are going to occur between like 15 and 25. So we will see like athletics definitely playing like a role here, but in sort of the more active years and stuff, but I mean, like I said, it can happen to anybody. So a lot of research has suggested, if we're looking at this and we understand there's a problem, that by enhancing your stabilization, your body control, right, doing lots of balance exercises, stabilization exercises, that will alleviate the incidence of non-contact injuries. Because like you think about it, it's like, okay, well, a non-contact injury is like I got injured because I tried to move in a way that my body can move, but I'm not very good at moving that way, like, or like I just wasn't ready to move that way. I'm used to this type of motion and I tried to do that type of motion. And then that ended up resulting in a tear. So that's going to be a really, really common one. We'll look more at that. So let's look at the specific ones. One of our other common ones that we're going to see is a meniscus tear. Here are 2 different types of meniscus tear. Here's just sort of your traditional type where it tore from one side to the other. This is called a bucket handle tear because it looks like you could, thread your hand under sort of between there and it's like a handle. So your meniscus, imagine these are not torn. Imagine these just kind of sit here like this. Your menisci, which is what I'm supposed to say. I always say meniscuses, and that's not right. It's your menisci. And what they are is, you've got your shin bone here, right? Like your shin bone is where your femur inserts. And it's kind of hard to see what the femur looks like here, but let's just look at the femur. not femur. If we look at the bottom of your femur, it's got these big knobs on the end of it, right? These big condyles. And so those condyles rest on the top of your tibia. Your tibia kind of makes this like big platform for those two condyles to sit. Well, what your meniscus does is we say that it increases the concavity of your tibial insertion, right? So what that means is like it just makes a bigger, gap, a bigger dent for your knee to kind of sit into. And so now it almost looks like a little bit like a half pipe, right? Like you can see it's like thicker on the outside and thinner on the inside, and thicker on the outside and thinner on the inside. That's how your meniscus are. And so what that does is that kind of creates like a shape sort of like this, which keeps your knee from sliding out over both sides. So it increases like the cavity there that allows your femur to sit on and rest on your tibia without ever dislocating itself. So what happens is like, if you have like a lot of like, particularly like what we call shearing forces, where it's like pressing and twisting, right? Is that's going to create like, that can create, a tear in that meniscus lining. So, that's not so great, right? That's definitely something we want to avoid. Next one we're definitely going to see ACL ligaments, right? So, anterior cruciate ligaments or ACL ligament tears, right? This is a stretching or tearing of the ACL ligament. One of our most common sports-related injuries, not as common as like a lateral ankle sprain, but definitely very common. Very often a non-contact injury, which is a freaking bummer because that means that like it really just shouldn't have happened. And it usually occurs during like a really hard plant and a cut. So when you like drive your leg into the ground and then twist, that twisting motion is what actually creates this tear. And that's because you can see here, here is your ACL ligament, right? So it's the anterior cruciate ligament. And it's that because it's in the front, it's anterior, and it's the cruciate ligament because there is another one. There's your posterior cruciate ligament that goes behind it. And so it's named after the fact that it makes a cross. You think about like the word like to crucify, on a cross, right? That's where these ligament names come from. So you get your anterior cruciate ligament and your posterior cruciate ligament, and they make an X. So you can see here, right? Like, if this is in the anterior portion, and this is a little bit thinner than the posterior. The posterior one's a little thicker too, so that's another reason why it doesn't tear as commonly. A question. What's up?
Hey, Brad. I don't know, it's like out of like context, but is it bad if let's say when you squat and all this stuff and your knees are always cracking or popping?
So, okay, so that's what we were talking a little bit about earlier. We're talking about like the Rice Krispie knees, right? Yeah, so that actually, so is it bad? I would say it is just left of neutral. Like I wouldn't classify it as an injury, which would be real bad, right? But at the same time, like it is a sign that there is some tightness in there that's kind of pulling on the knee more than it needs to. Right. So you're hearing fluid kind of moving around in the kneecap because basically connective tissue is just pulled a little too tight. And so like if you can actually loosen up your hip flexors, those are your and like which is part of your quad muscles, if you can actually improve your mobility there, oftentimes that's enough to fix that problem. Unless you have aching happening. If you have like pain in the knee while you're doing that stuff, then it could be something else.
No, it's not painful at all. It's just like, just popping.
Yeah, you just hear it, right? You're like, good Lord, that's loud,
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. And honestly, it is fine. It is something to work on though, because it could lead to dysfunction when you're older.
Right.
But I wouldn't call it an injury at that point. If it doesn't hurt, you're honestly fine. Same thing's true with any popping that you hear. Anytime you hear a joint pop, you're like, right? Freak out a little bit. It's fine as long as it didn't hurt. Hurting, not so great.
Got it. Okay, cool.
Which is funny because I mean, like that's totally how we kind of think, anyways. And that's actually like one of those things that's like it's where like sort of layman information, right? Like basic, like non-expert information actually does kind of match up with our expert information. It's like, yeah, if popping doesn't hurt, it's honestly okay. So So looking at these ligaments here, we're looking at your ACL, looking at your ACL and looking at your PCL here. So the ACL one, right? If we look at it, right, it is tied from the lateral side and crosses over and attaches in the front to the medial side. So it's going from lateral to medial. So if you think about like twisting, right? Like let's say this person's planting, this is their right knee, right? So if they plant really hard into the right and then they twist over their right shoulder to make a cut, right? Like you know, maybe you're playing football or some sport and you're looking at, you know, you're looking, like if it was me playing Ultimate, right? I'd be looking at my handler and then I would turn and break down the line to go for like a long bomb, right? So that twisting, right? I'm going to twist around to this side. I'm going to twist this way, which means that the femur is going to get pulled like this along this ligament, which is now going to get overstretched. And so that twisting motion is what often leads to ACL tears because it's pulling it this way and this way. You're basically just over lengthening this connective tissue and it's not ready for it, right? Like I said, the same thing can happen to the PCL, but it's pretty rare because like we have a lot of rotational ability in that direction. But one of the other reasons why ACL tears are so bad, and one of the things we're going to look at here in just a minute, is if we look at like knee, what's called knee valgus, a knee caving in posture, right? Look at this. This is a normal, that's a normal like knee right there, right? That's what we're looking for in a normal like knee joint. It's nice and evenly distributed in terms of space. But look at this. Now this side is collapsed and this side is there's a big gap here, right? So what's happening is your ACL ligament, which is running from here to here, right, is in a shortened position. It's getting to relax all day. It's getting to contract all day. It's just stuck like this. So one day you try to sprint and cut and you rotate your body around this way. And then suddenly you're performing maybe a motion that kind of looks like this, actually. This is actually poor posture as well. This is like a knee varus. This is like bow-legged syndrome. But let's just say like this person moves from here to this. They're trying to like rotate and spin around. They wouldn't be doing it on both legs. They'd probably do it on one side. Well, look, see that changes the angle there. So now this is overstretching on one side. So that ligament that's not used to getting stretched out tears, right? Just like the ankle. Too much eversion leads to a tear when you finally do inversion. Well, too much adduction and internal rotation leads to a tear when you finally do abduction and external rotation. So those are your ACL and PCL ligaments. Those are your cruciate ligaments. Now you have also got, you can see them here, your LCL ligament. That's your lateral collateral ligament, and your MCL, which is your medial collateral ligament. So you can see here, these are a little bit different, right? So MCL tears, right, is a stretching or a tearing of the medial ligament that attaches your femur to your tibia. This is typically a contact injury. This one is pretty rare to see like an injury without actually getting hit by someone. But basically what happens here is, again, like this is the medial side, right? So the inner thigh, if you get smacked real hard, and then that causes your shin bone to move, laterally away, that's going to overstretch that, and that's going to result in a rupture or a tear or whatever. So typically it's like a teammate falling on another one, or sometimes it happens like during soccer, like slide tackling, that can sometimes happen. And then the other one is we got a PCL tear, right? That's that posterior ligament there in the back. Like I said, this one's pretty rare. This is often very not injured. It's very thick, which is one reason why it doesn't happen very often. It's a pretty friggin' thick ligament. And then the other reason is generally this would be like you need to rotate your knees inward. And for the most part, like the reason we don't do that very often is because like, well, you're not gonna, your other leg's in the way. Like we just don't have that much range of motion going in the other direction. So it just doesn't have that, we don't see that very often. It can sometimes happen though. You'll see it happen with somebody who has like a locked leg. like as they're like twisting, usually kind of a contact situation as well. And then sometimes we'll see the LCL get torn. That's your lateral collateral ligament. Again, that's the one on the outside. So again, in a client whose knees are caving in, that LCL ligament, right, which is running right here, you know, we can see that is sort of in a shortened state. But luckily for that ligament, at least, it's attached to your fibula, which is a real small bone that's able to kind of rotate here. And so this one's also pretty infrequently injured. If an LCL tear happens, that's another like tackling injury. Usually it happens from getting hit from the side and, you know, popping that knee inward. So we'll see those occasionally. Now, Charlie, you asked about like the popping knees a little bit earlier, right? So here's what's somewhat related to that. And I said it wasn't an injury, but here's where it could eventually lead to this next condition that we'll often sometimes see in our clients. And that is called Patellar Tendinopathies. Remember yesterday I said like tende stands for, you know, we're talking about tendons, right? And then pathy is like a disorder, right? So it's like a tendon disorder. So patellar tendinopathy is tendinitis. It is tendinitis of your patellar tendon. So your patellar tendon, oh, and this is most commonly referred to as jumper's knee. You'll often hear it referred to as jumper's knee. And what that is, that's pain or inflammation or sometimes swelling just at the bottom of the kneecap. So what the heck, you know, leads to this? Well, it's very common amongst athletes who perform a lot of jumping motions because there's a lot of impact involved with like jumping up and down. So what ends up happening is that impact causes, you know, a very intense rubbing sensation on your patella here with this tendon. And it's usually caused by tight quadricep muscles. So, tendon. So looking at your patellar tendon, remember I mentioned this a little bit when we were going over like connective tissue in class. When you look at your patellar tendon, a lot of times it gets drawn like this, where it looks like your quadricep muscle inserts onto the patella here and then picks up down below. That's not how that works. What it actually does is it runs over top of it. That's a much better picture right there. You can see this tendon runs all the way down and runs over top of the kneecap and then inserts onto the shin bone. That's your patellar tendon, okay? So your patella is embedded underneath your quadriceps muscles. So when those quadricep muscles get really, really tight, what ends up happening, and it can happen in all of them, right? It can get tight in a bunch of different directions. What happens is that can pull your kneecap in some funky directions. And when you look at like how your kneecap's supposed to, I just saw it, where did it go? There's a great picture. Well, I clicked this one and I saw it down here. Oh, come on, internet. I just saw it. I saw the lateral groove. So what happens is your patella has a hard time tracking through this groove that it is supposed to be able to move in. Yeah, kind of like that. So this is kind of showing you what happens when your quadricep muscles get tight, right? It can pull it superiorly, or it can pull it laterally or medially sometimes. You know, you'll see those movements there. God dang it. That's so funny. I saw the picture I needed to kind of highlight this. All right. Oh, actually, and then there's a really good picture as well. What did I just see? Here you can actually kind of see, okay, there's actually a picture showing a fractured patella, so don't pay attention to that. But there's that quadriceps tendon, right? It runs over top and inserts here. So looking at that, if we look at like patellar tracking, there it is. This is the picture I'm looking for. Frickin' A. We can see here, right? So this is your femur when your knee is bent, okay? And you can see your patella, your kneecap is actually supposed to kind of slide along this groove. It looks like, you know, it's got this little gap. If you have like cracky knees, what's happening is this is probably dragging a little bit. And so it's moving fluid. You're not hearing like bone cracking, right? You're not hearing bone drag on bone. You'd feel a lot of pain if you felt that. But you're feeling like fluid kind of be squeezed out of, very thin, a thin margin of space between where this bone is moving. So that's what leads to that kind of knee cracking. So yeah, let's loosen up those quadricep muscles, right? And Charlie, if I remember right, like hip flexors are a little tight, right? Like that was one of the things we looked at.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Well, you know what, Brad? Since that class, man, I've been doing a lot of like, especially after I work out, man, stretches and like just warm-ups related to the workouts I'm about to do, man, and I've been way better.
You feel better? Yeah.
Yeah.
Dude, it's so funny because it's sort of the least active part of the workout, right? Like the warm up and the cool down. So we kind of get eager. It's like when I work out, like my concept, right? Like I teach this stuff, at a professional level, right? But my brain still like sees working out as like, I want to be bloody and sweaty, like it's my battle time,
No, for real, man. And like honestly with you, I've never really warmed up before like a workout like that.
Yeah.
Especially doing like SMR and all that, man, or like dynamic stretching. Yeah. And like sometimes, like I work out and I have my brother and my sister work out with me, and they're like, wow, why do we have to roll ourselves out? What is this help for? And I'm like, I do like, like only if you guys knew, like it's like, it's like the best thing to do before a workout,
Oh, it's a big deal because then you move with good form, and then your brain you get better at the movements anyways by doing that.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to learn how to squat improperly. Well, at least they shouldn't want to. Love that. All right. So the next one we're going to see is patellar. So we said patellar tendinopathy. Next one we're going to see is iliotibial. It's a fun word to say. Band syndrome. We call it the IT band, right? So this is your iliotibial band. Okay. And your IT band is kind of unique. It's not really just muscular the way like a lot of other muscles are very, muscular. It's like you get the muscle in the middle and then it becomes like kind of connective tissue. And then, that's where it's a tendon and then inserts onto a bone. Your IT band is mostly fascia. It is not very muscular. It has contractile capabilities, but it's not meant to be like a real big contracting muscle. So your IT band runs across here, and you can see, like, look at all this connective tissue, right? There's the connective tissue for your glutes, right? Kind of tying into this. But then we see, like, running right here from your ASIS over to your hip, that is your tensor fascia latae, right? So it's running in this section right here. And then it works together. It becomes your IT band, which runs all the way down and inserts here. And by the way, that eventually runs down and becomes your freaking peroneals. Which we talked about yesterday. So this whole thing is like sort of a common thread line that runs all the way from the hip down the leg. And it's meant to create like stability on the outside of the leg. That's why there's so much fascia here, is because it's connective tissue that really holds your knee in place. And that's great until that connective tissue gets really tight. So what happens is sometimes you'll experience IT band syndrome, which we call runner's knee, or we'll call it runner's hip. Because what will happen is you'll get two areas where it will start rubbing. The muscle will actually get so tight that it no longer has space between it and the bone. So IT band syndrome, you're going to see two spots. You're either going to see pain down here at the knee or pain up here at the hip. And what's happening, if you look at your knee, right, is that IT band is rubbing on that outside portion of the knee. And so that connective tissue is rubbing on very hard tissue, your skeletal system. And that rubbing is creating inflammation, which is creating pain, right? And that's causing it to further tighten up. It's very similar to plantar fasciitis, right? Fasciitis is, a rubbing sensation that causes inflammation. Same thing's happening up here at the hip. At your hip, if you look at all the way at the top of the hip, it's more common than, there's a great picture, by the way. Love that. That's a great picture of the IT band. You can see how much fascia is there. Where is that? Okay, we'll go. Sometimes it'll happen at the hip as well. Come on, internet, hook me up with the picture I want. That might work. All right, let's just take IT band out of there. So what happens if you look at your femur, right? Your femur has this big knob on the outside of it here, right? You can feel that in the side of your hip bone. Well, that IT band runs up over top of that and grabs the pelvis up here. So that starts rubbing, right? And this is sort of what we can kind of see here, right? Like the IT band, you know, it's going to run all the way through, and there, right there, that knob that's sticking out, it starts rubbing on that. And so it'll be very painful. It feels like someone's holding a match to your freaking knee or to your hip. This is something I've struggled a little bit with. I've had runner's knee in the past before I kind of worked in changing my running form. I used to deal with that in high school and just in the beginning years of college and stuff. It's a real pain in the rear. And you got to loosen up that IT band and really work on strengthening the medial aspect of your glutes. Lots and lots and lots of like sideways lateral movement. So Bay, what we were talking about the other day, right? Those abductions, that's like a really, really good one for this. And then like we talked about, oh, what's that?
That's right.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Like we talked about, patellofemoral pain, right? So that poor, they call it patellofemoral pain, or we just call it like poor patellar tracking. Okay. It just means that there's overactive and underactive muscles that are all kind of pulling your kneecap in the wrong direction, right? So it could be pulled medially or laterally, or, you know, inferiorly or superiorly, or it can be pulled in like rotational directions, you know, inferolaterally or infromedially, right? So that causes like the patella to not move through that groove the way it's supposed to. We look at like patellar tracking, right? It's meant to kind of move through that groove as it goes up. And so if it can't do that, if it's being pulled and it's grinding on one side or the other, that's going to lead to pain. So those are sort of our most common injuries, right? So we kind of talked a lot about them. I got to use some of the terminology already, but now let's kind of look at the main bones we're going to be looking at today. Luckily, there's a much shorter list, right? Like there's to lots of bones in your foot and ankle complex, but in your knee, we've got your patella, your femur, which is a big freaking thigh bone, and your tibia and fibula. So the tibia and fibula arrangement, right? And by the way, this, you might notice this looks exactly like the same. If we look at like, this looks exactly the same as your upper arm as well. So we look at like, when we look at like our skeletal system, right? You'll notice it's actually arranged like this. It goes, this is one of the characteristics that makes us a mammal, actually. But it goes from one bone to two bones to lots of bones in the wrist to your digits, right? The lots of bones in the wrist and the palm to digits, right? And then we see the same thing here. We see one bone, two bones, lots of bones in the ankle and the bridge of the foot, and your digits. That's called the one bone, two bone structure. And it's very common. I mean, that's what one of the things that classifies us as like a mammal, one bone, two bone structure. So it's like one bone, two bones, lots of bones, digits. And you'll see it in dogs. One, two, lots, digits. You'll see it in cats. You'll see it in horses even. Pretty much every mammal you've got. Pretty much every mammal you've got. So that's sort of what we're looking at here. So we can definitely see that one bone, two bone structure when we look at our knee joint, right? We got a one large bone that is your femur, and that's the longest, biggest bone you've got. And then your tibia just below that, your fibula to the side there, which is allowing rotational to happen between these two. And then your patella, which is kind of interesting because you're like, okay, well, what does that allow me to have, right? Because now we're looking at it and it's like, well, what's the, oh, it's like, we got this bone here and these two bones here. Wouldn't that be enough to have a hinge joint? Yeah, absolutely. You actually don't need your patella to create hinging, at least in order to create the joint movement. But your patella is one of the coolest freaking bones in your body because what it does is it enhances what we call mechanical advantage. And mechanical advantage is kind of what we spent time talking a little bit about when we were looking at levers. Remember when we were sort of just before the midterm, we were talking about the different types of levers that you've got, first, second, third class, right? Well, depending on where like the pivot point is versus where the resistance is pulling, you've got a different type of lever, and some of them are more advantageous to others. So for instance, if you've ever looked at like a cable machine, if you look at like how pulleys make work easier, we're starting to get into like, you know, the math side of this, which I'm not so great at teaching. But if we look at like how pulleys work, right? What's kind of interesting about this is, you know, this by pulling up like this is actually going to reduce the amount of force necessary to lift this brick up, right? Whereas this, because it only goes through the pulley like one time, is actually going to make it, you know, this isn't going to have the same effect. This is going to be a little bit less effective. Whereas this version where it's like pulley, 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 right? This basically, think about it as like this reduces the amount of force necessary to pull something by about 50%. So then you're, you know, dividing that even further down, right? Just like I was installing, I was putting a new TRX bracket into the wall of my house recently, and they sell them with like 2 bolt spots. And I was like, I don't know. And I bought like a 4-bolt one, you know, and I went to the hardware store and I got like some lag shields and like a big bolt. And it was, you know, it was like, how much are these like rated for in like brick? And she was like, about 500 pounds each. And I'm not going to weigh 500 pounds, but I was like, all right, great. So by putting 1 bolt in, that was 500, another one that was 1,000, and then 2 more, that's 2,000 pounds. So like that, the wall's coming down before that bracket's coming out, you know? And that's because like those 4 different places, that gives it even more like mechanical advantage. It gives it more advantage to stay attached to the wall. Each one of those takes the pressure off the other ones. So what your kneecap does is it increases mechanical advantage. So I want to show you this really fun little video here, how the patella creates mechanical advantage. So this is such a simple explanation, and I gotta build one of these. I gotta make one of these and just bring it into class because it's so freaking cool. So he's using a rubber band, and this is acting just like your knee joint. It's a hinge joint, right? There's a little, you know, hinge here, and this rubber band runs down and it goes over top of the this little stone that's glue sticked here, and inserts onto here. So when he pulls, in order to extend the knee, the quadriceps muscles contract. We can see that movement, right? So that's normal knee extension. This is exactly your quadriceps contract this way, boom, drags the knee up like that, right? Pretty basic stuff, right? Nothing too complicated there. But here, look at that. Like it's still attached in the same spot, and it is creating some knee flexion, right? Or I'm sorry, knee extension, right? It's still it's creating a little bit of movement, but like look at how bad that contraction is, right? And that's because this is a 3rd class lever, and 3rd class levers don't have a lot of natural mechanical advantage. So by placing this, which brings the pivot point just out just a little bit, now suddenly your kneecap, gives you a ton of mechanical advantage, and boom, it's just very easy to contract the knee up. So the patella is so freaking cool. It's one of the coolest bones in your body. And we definitely want to make sure that it tracks the way it's supposed to. We want it to move in that groove properly. Looking at this, we got a couple different joints here, right? We've got your Tibiofemoral Joint. That's the knee joint, right? Like it's where your tibia, this bone down here, meets with your femur. So tibiofemoral. Then you've got patellofemoral, where your kneecap is interacting with your femur and it moves up that groove that we mentioned, right? That's your patellofemoral joint. And then we've got at the knee, your superior tibiofibular joint, where your tibia is interacting with your fibula. So your fibula is down here, and it's, again, this is what allows us to have like pronation and supination, or rotation of our shin bones, right? So your fibula doesn't actually interact with your knee, which is kind of ironic, right? Like we talk about it because it's here, but it's totally not interacting with your femur in any capacity, except for, there's some muscles that are attaching from one to the other. So, and that joint right there, this is where your hamstring muscles are inserting right on the back of that fibula there. So some more special structures that are in the knee that we're going to see if we look at it, right? Look at all of the other different types of connective tissue that is inside of our kneecap, right? You can see we've got our menisci, but then we also see there's a lining of cartilage. So cartilage is there to reduce the friction within our joints. And then see this right here, this kind of yellow section? That's actually called a fat pad. And there's little deposits of fat that live in your knee. And you can kind of feel them, actually. If you reach underneath your kneecap, you can kind of feel that little squishy part. That's your fat pad. And you're feeling, this is meant to, again, reduce friction, right? And then you're going to see a whole bunch of these little fluid-filled sacs called your bursa or bursae. And the bursa is basically this little sac filled with this fluid, kind of like synovial fluid. And that's the other thing. Inside this joint cavity, there is a ton of synovial fluid, which again is there to just act like grease on a hinge. So we've got all these different materials that are there to reduce the amount of friction in our knee when we're performing extension and flexion or rotation, but that gets worn down over time. If you have tight muscles and you're moving with improper posture, and that's causing that connective tissue to get beat up here and there, well, that's going to lead to alterations in how you move, and that's going to lead to things like arthritis. And that's all arthritis is. Arthritis is nothing more than, you're breaking down your connective tissue. And it's no longer, providing stability or protection from impact. So lots of little bursa in there. Right. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about before we dive into our muscles, let's talk about what proper knee alignment looks like. So this is sort of our big concept related to posture. If I want you to know what posture is, we are going to describe what is proper posture. It's an optimally aligned, what we call Q angle. And so the Q angle is a central line of pull for the quadriceps that runs from your ASIS to your patella. So your ASIS, that's this little knob here on the front of your hip. You can feel it actually if you dig your thumbs in. That little knob on the front of your pelvis. We call it your ASIS because it's your anterior superior iliac spine. This is your ilium. It's anterior, it's above, right? And it's along this spine here. So that's your ASIS. Now, if you were to draw a line from your ASIS to the center of your kneecap, and then you would draw another line just 90 degrees up towards the ceiling, what's the difference between that 90-degree angle and your ASIS angle? Normally, we want that to be somewhere less than 15 degrees. Okay, that's what we want that angle to be at least in males. In females, we want it to be something less than 20 degrees. Women have a wider pelvis, so their ASIS is going to be a little bit more out here, so they get a deeper angle than we do. And so we're going to see a difference in those ASISs there, right, in that Q angle. So your Q angle is what determines whether you are properly aligned. We want it to be at a little bit of an angle, right? We don't want it to be, we do want it 15 degrees or less. We don't want it zero angle either. I don't want it to be straight up and down. That would actually be bad. If there was a 0-degree angle, that'd be bad too. But we certainly don't want it to be a really deep angle. If the knees cave in, we're going to have an excessive Q angle. So like I said, we're going to see women will have a naturally wider Q angle. But what we know about an increased Q angle, if it's going above 20 degrees, we call that knee valgus, okay, or the knees caving in posture. And then a decreased Q angle, where it's basically just straight up and down, that's a knee varus, or also that's an external rotation. That's knees caving out. So increased Q angle. So this is what this kind of looks like here. You can see different versions of what this angle looks like, right? So here's like a normal angle, right? That's 15 degrees there. But then we see sort of that knock-kneed posture, right? That is an increased Q angle. Or we'll see a client with sort of that bow-legged posture, right? The knees caving in versus the knees caving out. And that will be knee varus, right? So we got knee valgus here, and we got knee varus over here. Very, very common things that lead to injuries, right? If you're excessively performing knee valgus all day, and then all of a sudden you try to go do like a rotational movement, what's going to happen? You're going to tear that ACL, because that ACL is in a shortened position right now, running this way. And then all of a sudden when you try to rotate your foot out, again, or your knee out, it creates that tearing action, right? So we're looking for, less than 15 degrees for men. So, somewhere around like 10 to 12 would probably be pretty good. And then we want to see like anywhere less than 20 for women. So, somewhere from like 15 to 16, 17, 18, something right in there would be pretty ideal. So I kind of want to show you one more. Yeah, this is great. So, and you can see, look what happens to the bones, right? Your bones are misaligned, right? In knee varus, right? Bow-legged posture. That sort of looks like you're getting off a freaking horse, they've been riding a saddle all day. We see a gap on this side of the kneecap, and we see a grinding on this side of the kneecap. And then when the knees are knock-kneed and they're caving in, right, we see the exact same thing, but in reverse. We see the outside collapsing. We see the inside gapping. And this one right here, that knock-kneed posture, is so, so, so common, right? When we see that pronation, distortion, syndrome, one of our 3 most common postural distortions we are going to see in our clients, right? What that is it is the feet falling inward, and then that's causing the knees to also cave inward, right? So we see the feet flatten. That causes the tibia to internally rotate, drags the knee with it. That causes the femur to internally rotate, right? And we see this knock-kneed posture here. Not awesome. Not awesome. We are trying to fix that, right? So we got to get from here, they're caving in, to here, where they're tracking properly, okay? And that's what we're going to talk about today. I love this. Actually, I forgot about this picture. So yeah, higher Q angle, right? It leads to all kinds of injuries. It can lead to low back problems. It can lead to hip problems, right? Think about like the IT band, right? Look at that runner's hip, right? That IT band has to stretch from here around this bone and grab over here. And you're pulling the insertion site further away. So it's rubbing here, or it's rubbing right along this like condyle here. So we're just going to rub on the outside of your fibula, right? Yeah, that's that IT band syndrome. So IT band syndrome or ACL tears, all kinds of things that are really common. Any questions on that, guys? Everybody feeling pretty confident? They understand like the Q angle and stuff? Talking about what our normal knee alignment is. I'd say key pieces of vocabulary: knee valgus, Q angle. Be familiar with the bones, right? Any questions on any of that? All right. Cool. So let's look at the different muscles, right? So we got our hamstrings, we got our quads, we've got the abductors on the outside, and we got our adductors on the inside. So we got to look at a pretty large group of muscles today. Let's see here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 muscles. Not too bad. Twice as many as we saw yesterday. So looking at your hamstring complex, right? So your hamstrings located on the posterior aspect of your thigh, right? The back of the thigh. We're going to see 3 muscles here that we got to talk about, but one of them we have to talk about, it's 2 separate fibers. So there's actually going to be 4 things to talk about in your hamstring, but there are 3 muscles, okay? One of those muscles just has 2 sort of sets of fibers. So that's the first one we're going to look at. We're going to look at what's called your biceps femoris, or your biceps femoris. And we're going to be looking at the long head first. So when you look at this is going to run from the back of your pelvis all the way down and it's going to insert onto your fibula right here. So when it pulls, it is going to perform knee flexion, right? That's going to drag your knee, your heel up towards your butt, right? It's going to create that knee flexion. So when we say that, we say, right, and that's your lateral hamstring, right? The biceps femoris is your outside hamstring muscle, the lateral hamstring. So it's isolated function. Remember, it always concentrically, it always is accelerating. The joint we're talking about in this case is going to be your knee. The movement we're talking about is flexion. So the main purpose of your biceps femoris is to concentrically accelerate knee flexion. The other thing that it does is it does a little bit of hip extension as well, because it's running all the way from the hip down to your lower like calf area. So your biceps femoris long head is not only doing knee flexion, it's also assisting in hip extension. So it works with your glutes to drive your femur posteriorly. And then it also does just a little bit of tibial external rotation. And so, you know, it's attaching down here and it'll do just a little bit of that tibial external rotation. So tibial external rotation in the knee doesn't happen unless your knee is bent. So if you're at home right now and you want to try this, right, you can't rotate your knee unless you bend first, right? Once I bend my knee, then I can rotate out like this. And if you place your hand on the back of your, on the lateral posterior side of your hamstring and you move your foot out like that, you will feel this muscle contract. That is your biceps femoris contracting. So the long head runs the entire length. It runs from the pelvis down, and so it performs hip extension, but it's also tied to the outside of the fibula, so that does tibial external rotation, and then it is a hamstring muscle, so it's performing knee flexion. Integrated function, flip it around. Instead of concentric, we eccentric. Instead of accelerate, we decelerate. It's still the knee joint, so that one we don't flip. But instead of flexion, we're saying extension. Instead of hip extension, we're saying hip flexion. And instead of internal or external rotation, we're saying internal rotation. And then it is there to also isometrically stabilize the knee and the lumbopelvic hip complex, because those are the two joints that it's attached to. So eccentrically decelerates knee extension, hip flexion, and tibial internal rotation. So that's your biceps femoris long head. And then right flexes the knee. And tibial external rotation. So we see that tibial external rotation, that rotating that we talked about with the hand behind the back of the thigh. It does that. So it can only do the rotation part and it can only do the flexion part. This muscle right here, the biceps femoris short head, is one of our most commonly overactive muscles in our clients. This is one of our biggest, most commonly right, when we look at this, right, the knee is caving this way. Look at what that is, right? His foot is turned away. He's literally pulling his knee like this and then rotating his foot away. So that's why the biceps femoris, you're going to see it on so many overactive muscles lists, right? When we look at that overhead squat solution table, right? That table that tells us like, hey, your posture looks like this. This is what's overactive, right? Take a look. If we see the feet turning out, that's the biceps femoris short head. If we see the knees caving in, that's the biceps femoris short head. There's one more. If we see the feet flatten, right, that's the biceps femoris short head. So very, 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 very commonly overactive muscle. It's on the list a bunch of times because that muscle, watch, you know, we're literally going to look on the internet of, you know, people who are demoing how to exercise, right? Like these pictures were are on websites or videos or whatever, teaching people how to do stuff. And let's take a look here and see how their form really is if we actually break some of it down. Let's take a look at this lady right here. You can see how her knees are actually bowing outward, which is causing this tibia to inwardly rotate. And then we see the feet are at a weird angle, right? So she's actually performing, you know, the movement. Look at this guy. He's rotating his feet away, right? So they're performing the knee flexion part, but they're also performing extra knee external rotation. So that knee external rotation is really strengthening the biceps femoris short head more than it's strengthening the normal part of the hamstring. There's another one, right? Feet are turning out away during the hamstring curl, right? Very freaking common, you know, and this is something that you'll do without realizing it. So this is one of the reasons why it's so important when you're on a hamstring curl machine, the rest of the hamstring. And what will happen is this muscle is going to get tight, and then all of a sudden you're going to try and extend the leg, and you're going to tear it, right? Or maybe one of those weaker muscles that doesn't get used all that often. All of a sudden, one day you try to recruit it and you try to use it, and boom, you tear one of those. So biceps femoris long head accelerates knee flexion and hip extension, as well as tibial external rotation. Biceps femoris short head, knee flexion, and tibial external rotation. Doesn't attach to the hip, so it doesn't do any hip movement. Now, let's talk about the weak hamstring muscles, the ones that don't get enough attention. Now, these are going to be identical to each other. These are actually going to be, they're going to do the same thing. They're isolated function. This is your medial hamstring. So instead of, you know, there's the biceps femoris long head that we mentioned, right? It goes to the outside. This is your inside hamstring, right? This is your semimembranosus and your semitendinosus. So your semimembranosus, or the medial hamstring, accelerates knee flexion. You know, of course, it's a hamstring muscle. It accelerates hip extension because again, it's attached from the hip and to the tibia there, right? So it's running the entire length. So it's hip extension as well, and it does tibial internal rotation, which is the opposite of that biceps femoris. So you can see the medial hamstring is a synergist with the biceps femoris when it comes to sagittal plane movements. They both work together to perform like knee flexion, but they are antagonists to one another in the transverse plane. One does internal rotation and the other one does external rotation. So your medial hamstring does the internal rotation. So if you've got a client whose foot is turning out, we need to get that internal rotation to come back. We need to get them back to neutral. So we need to strengthen the medial aspect of the hamstring. How do you do that? Well, you do those freaking hamstring curls, but you do it with your toes pointing forward, right? Or you can even do like a slight inward point if you really, you know, if you want to kind of fire up the medial part. But I don't recommend that either, because then that's just teaching poor mechanics. I don't really like overcorrecting that much. So that's your semimembranosus, and then you've got your semitendinosus. It's the exact same thing. You'll notice they basically tie to the same spot, just that the tendinosus is kind of running underneath. So there's what we see in the membranosus and tendinosus. And look at my slide here. See how the definition is literally not changing? They're identical. It's just the picture is different. So semimembranosus and semitendinosus, knee flexion, hip extension, and internal tibial rotation. Any questions on the hamstrings, guys? Toes in alignment? None of this.
Definitely, yes.
Right? And hey, the reason I'm like putting a lot of emphasis on this, like you might notice I got a little more stank on it today. This is very personal to me. I have bad biceps femoris biomechanics. Like my hamstrings love to use those. My feet love to turn out, and I have to like constantly keep an eye on it and keep my toes pointing forward, because like the outside part of my hamstring always wants to do work. It's the devil's muscle. All right. You can see actually like all the kind of quads kind of separated, right? And they're all going to do different things. So first we're going to look at all three of these straight up, just the first three quadriceps only muscles. And then we've got the fourth one, right? Quad, 4, which is going to be also a hip flexor. So vastus intermedius. And see the text, literally not changing. All three of these are the same. The three are, just quadriceps only muscles are literally, all they do is knee extension. So vastus lateralis, the one on the outside, that concentrically accelerates knee extension. That's all it does. It just extends the knee. It's your kicking muscle, right? It's your leg extension muscle, right? And then lateralis is on the lateral aspect of the thigh. Flipping to the other side, we've got your vastus medialis. That's your inner quadricep muscle. Your VMO, your vastus medialis oblique. Most of the time, you're going to hear people call it the VMO. And that's your medial quadricep muscle that runs down. Again, concentrically accelerates knee extension, right? It's accelerating knee extension. And then you've got your vastus intermedius, which starts sort of in between, right? We see the lateralis on the lateral condyle there. Medialis is sort of starting in the middle on the inside portion. Intermedius runs down just in the center of the bone and then runs down, right? So your vastus intermedius is the one that we generally don't see because it's going to be covered by this next muscle we look at. But that's the middle, right? Intermedius. It's into the middle of the other two vasti muscles. So you got 3 vastis, right? Lateral, medial, and intermedius. And they all perform knee extension. They do have ever so slightly different integrative functions, though. Integrative wise, they do just something a little bit different from one another, which is like, the lateralis is going to decelerate internal rotation. The medialis is going to decelerate external rotation. So this is where, they're tied to different portions of your patella, right? So therefore, like if your VMO is too tight, it's going to pull the patella inward. If your lateralis is too tight, it's going to pull it outward, right? So it kind of can drag your kneecap around and lead to that poor patellar tracking. Generally, the big bad guy here in most clients is going to be the vastus lateralis. So Charlie, like the knee cracking, right, could be tightness in the lateral aspect of your thigh. So if you're placing a foam roller, pull that roller along the outside there. Fair warning, that's going to suck.
Yeah, actually, I do that, but I use a hand roller though.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. That's great. Yeah. So you go sort of on the outside part. That usually, at least, most people, it's the lateralis that's too tight. Yeah. And then generally the medialis is a little bit weak because, like knee extension movements. So if you were to do like a knee extension while also like squeezing a medicine ball or a squishy ball or something like that, that can kind of activate hip musculature. But you're like, wait a minute, we got one more quad muscle, right? Because it's quad, stands for 4. Why haven't we talked about that yet? Well, it's because technically it's a hip muscle. It's actually, we're getting more into hip anatomy here. And so this is going to be your rectus femoris, your rectus femoris. This is the big king of quad muscles. So it's the 4th one, but it is not only acting as a knee extensor. Your vasti muscles, right? They attached from the femur to the tibia, right? Look at the vasti muscles. Femur to tibia. Your rectus femoris is running from your pelvis to your tibia. Therefore, it is doing knee movement, but it is also doing hip flexion as well. So again, kind of like the hamstring muscles, right? The biceps femoris short head, it can only do knee extension because it's only attached from the femur to the tibia. I'm sorry, to the fibula, right? So it can only do knee flexion. But the other hamstring muscle is attached to the hip. So they can do knee flexion and hip extension. So your rectus femoris is attached to the hip. It can do knee extension and hip flexion. So we're going to see that here, right? Isolated function, concentrically accelerates knee extension and hip flexion. This is your primary knee extensor, but it is also, like I said, acting as a hip flexor as well. So this is where generally we don't spend a lot of time like rolling the quads because these honestly aren't often that overactive. You got poor patellar tracking, yeah, kind of get in there and break some of that up. But for the most part, we're talking about like hip. We have a lot of hip dysfunction, right? We see a lot of like anterior tilting and stuff like that. So this is where this quad muscle has become overactive. So we find that ASIS, that hip bone, and we go just below it right here, and we find that thick cord where we're placing our foam rollers, you know, right about here, right in between like the hip and the condyle there. That is where we really feel that hip flexor stretch. So when you're doing like a kneeling hip flexor stretch, it's going to look like this, right? You are drawing your hip into hip extension. So it wants to pull, you know, this one right here is actually doing the flexion, right? It wants to pull the knee this way. But your other leg, you are drawing it into hip extension, right? Now, when we'll talk more about this on Monday, because that's the actual hip lesson. But remember, because this is also a quadricep muscle, how do you make this stretch more intense? You do this version right here. So now she's in hip extension and she's in knee flexion. So that is the two antagonist movements of that hip flexor. So if you've got an overactive rectus femoris, you know, this is a great stretch for that. I will say she's doing that on the straight up floor, which is like pretty ballsy. I would say do it on a pillow. It's much better. Or do it on a, you know, again, guys, go to Amazon. Get yourselves a $20 AirX pad. Bring it to every session with every client. You can use it to make stuff unstable. You can use it to kneel on when you're stretching your clients, and you can give it to your clients for them to kneel on when they're stretching their hip flexors, which, let me tell you, hip flexors, also one of our absolutely most common overactive muscles. So many freaking clients overactive rectus femoris, hip flexors. Now we got a couple stabilizers here that, again, we'll talk more that are primarily like hip musculature, right? So you have got your gracilis and your sartorius. So the gracilis is running along the inside here and grabbing. So it's going to actually act as like a hip adductor, right? It's on the inside part of the thigh, so it squeezes the knees towards each other. And then it is also going to do a little bit of hip flexion. It can kind of pull the hip upward. So it does do a little bit of hip flexion. But again, it's rotated here in the front, and it's grabbing this part of the tibia. So when it contracts, what does it do? Internal rotation, right? So that's going to pull the tibia inward, which is great. This is an often underactive muscle, right? So we see gracilis. When we look at our overhead solutions table, we will often see, you know, when we see like the feet turning out, our underactive muscles sometimes is going to be our gracilis. Or when we see like the knees cave in, right? We'll sometimes, actually it's not on here, but sometimes that'll be the gracilis as well. Another one that we've got is your sartorius. Fun fact, this is the longest muscle in your whole body. This thing is massive. It's just really long. It's like a freaking whip. And it's running from your ASIS all the way down, crossing over the thigh and inserting onto the inside here. So again, you can imagine like that's going to do some hip flexion, right? It's at the hip and it's grabbing here. So it's going to perform hip flexion. So sartorius, right? And it's also going to do external rotation, which is kind of funny because you're like, it's tight on the inside. Shouldn't that do internal rotation? But remember, it's running all the way across and makes a sort of an X there. So it's actually pulling in the opposite direction. And then this one actually pulls into abduction as well, which is also kind of surprising because you're like, it's on the inside. It should pull to the inside. Nope, it pulls to the outside because it's crossing all the way to the other side. Really, it's not doing much of those things. I'll be honest, like most of what your sartorius does is hip flexion, you know, and hip and a little bit of hip external rotation. But really, like your sartorius is mostly a hip. It's acting as like a hip flexor. So it's huge, and we'll sometimes see that on here as well. Where's that sartorius at? Come on. They're not putting it on this list. Ugh, awesome. You gonna give it to me on this one? There it is. So with the feet turning out, consistency, guys. With the feet turning out, you'll sometimes see the sartorius as being underactive there, right? Gracilis and sartorius. I will say both of these muscles pretty thin, they're not very beefy muscles. They really aren't supposed to do that much concentric work. Their primary role is to be there to create stability on the inside of the, they're very good stabilizer muscles. So when you're activating your sartorius and your gracilis, you're not going to do a ton of like specific concentric movement, but standing on one leg, doing a reverse lunge to balance, a step up to balance, doing something unstable and learning how to stabilize, those are great ways to strengthen both your gracilis and your sartorius. All right. Any questions on muscles so far as we went through the list? All right. So let's look at our movements, right? We've been talking about them, but let's review them real quick. So we've got knee flexion, right? That's going to be pulling your heel up towards your butt. You get knee extension, which is the opposite, right? That's going to be kicking your knee away, right? Like kicking a soccer ball. You've got tibial external rotation, right? Which is your tibia, you are rotating your foot outward. It can only happen if your knee is bent. And you get tibial internal rotation, right? And remember, this is what's kind of funny. Sometimes this gets confusing to people. When you think about like, let's see here, actually. When we look at pronation distortion syndrome, one of the things that sometimes confuses people who are studying this the first time, we talk about how like that's performing external rotation, right? Which we say like, you know, the biceps femoris right back here. You can even see it's like a little contracted in this picture. That biceps femoris short head performs that tibial external rotation. But we say that the knees are caving in. That's internal rotation, right? We see flattening, internal rotation, internal rotation. That's internal rotation of the knee joint, but it is external rotation in comparison. Like, look, we see the femur here. We see external tibial rotation. So yes, there's internal rotation, you know, happening to the bone overall, right? That's pronation that we're seeing there. But in relation to the upper bone, this is very much like turned outward. That's that tibial external rotation that we're talking about. And there we go. There we're going to see disc pain. We're going to see bursitis. We're going to see all kinds of problems associated with that. There's another really good picture. Right, that caving in action. So, not awesome. So tibial external rotation, tibial internal rotation. And those are our two, you know, basically our four key movements of our knee musculature. So the muscles that are responsible for the extension part, right? Here's your four quadriceps muscles, right? You've got your, this is going to be your rectus femoris here. That's sort of the one that's attached at the hip and it's running down and grabbing the tibia. So that's knee extension in this portion, but it's also doing hip flexion up above. Then we got our vastus lateralis is on the outside, grabbing to the front, right? Oops. Then we got our vastus medialis, grabbing on the inside, and our vastus intermedius, which is in between the two. So these three are underneath. These are considered deeper. And then your rectus femoris is considered much more superficial. It's kind of laying over top of these other quad muscles, particularly the vastus intermedius is the big one that it covers up. But we can see, right, they're kind of grabbing the patella in all different directions. So that can cause that patellar tracking. This is where you'll need to massage, you know, the inside or the outside. Like you'll look at like how your patella is tracking. I love this picture here. And then we can see like, here's our knee flexion prime movers, right? That's going to be your hamstring muscles, your semimembranosus and semitendinosus. These two are the medial hamstring, right? They both kind of start in the same place. One's just a little bit higher than the other. And then they run down and they grab the tibia down here, right? So there's the medial hamstring, these two sets right over here on the right. And then we see our lateral hamstring, which is your biceps femoris long and short head. So the long head runs from hip to knee. So it's performing knee flexion as well as hip extension. But the biceps femoris short head, it starts in the middle of the femur. So it only runs to the knees. That can only do knee flexion. And then both of them are going to pull that fibula, causing that rotational movement, right? External rotation. And there we go. There's so we see knee extension, rectus femoris, and then vastus lateralis, medialis, and intermedius. So there's your 4 quad muscles, right? And then you've got your knee flexion. That's your biceps femoris, long and short head, and then semimembranosus and semitendinosus. So 3 muscles in the hamstring there. By the way, if you're wondering why it's called the biceps femoris, bi stands for 2, and there's 2 separate sets of fibers. You will see the same arrangement in your biceps. You will see 2 sets of fibers, a long head and a short head. And they're going to look kind of similar. Again, 1 bone, 2 bone structure, right? So that's your biceps femoris, long head and short head, and then that's your medial hamstring. By the way, there's actually a picture here of one more internal rotator that we don't spend enough time talking about. NASM doesn't even have this in your friggin' textbook, but they do mention it sometimes. This is your popliteus. So this little itty bitty stabilizer muscle that does, internal rotation. Oy, none of that. So there's your popliteus, right? This little itty bitty muscle that does a little bit of internal rotation. And then external rotation, just your biceps femoris. This is all by itself. Particularly the short head, like I said, but both of the biceps femoris muscles do it. It's just often the short head is really the big bad guy here. And that's it. That's your guide to the knee, guys. So we got homework today. We got homework 3. You're going to see it's a little bit different. The pace is a little bit different than normal. Let me go to here, actually. Homework 3, not the answer key. So your questions for homework 3 are going to look a little different. They're going to be asking you questions about what the movements make, right? So which of the following motions is limited with an overactive gastrocnemius muscle, right? So that's a pretty, you got to remember, it's like, okay, well, what does my gastrocnemius do? It performs plantar flexion. So which motion is limited? If a muscle is overactive, it means it's contracting and doing too much of its job. It's doing its job too much. So if it's overactive plantar flexion, because that's what this does, that means that the motion that is limited would be the exact opposite, dorsiflexion. What's up, Charlie? Question.
Oh no, my bad, bro. It's because it was like cutting off and here.
Oh,
so I couldn't hear what you were saying.
Okay, my internet must be crapping out. So yeah, a lot of these questions, guys, it's all going to come down to you thinking about like, what does the muscle do concentrically? Now, if it's asking like what's limited, then you know that like, okay, well then the muscle's supposed to eccentric. It's the opposite of what it does because it's limited, right? So it's overly doing plantar flexion because that's what the gastrocnemius does. So the motion that's limited is going to be dorsiflexion. Which muscle only performs plantar flexion? You'll see, you got to look in your PowerPoint, right? And go look at the list and look for the one that only on this list, look for the one that only does plantar flexion. Your client's foot is flattening. What's causing that? What's overactive? What muscle flattens the foot inward, right? Remember, foot flattening is eversion and external rotation. So which muscle on this list does eversion and external rotation? So, you know, you're going to see a lot of pretty technical questions. If you have any questions for me, let me know, and I can walk you through those. But, oh God, we lost Charlie. His internet really did die. But that's pretty much all I got for you guys today. How are we feeling, guys? Questions? You feel good?
Good.
Confident that you're going to kill the homework?
I feel like I'm gonna have to rewatch it again. You did. This is in the email, correct?
Oh, absolutely. Yep.
Okay.
And you can find it in Canvas, you know. Honestly, if I were you, if you are going to review everything, I would honestly probably just skip to the part where I start getting into the muscles, you know, instead of just talking about the epidemiology stuff might not help that much, but like, yeah, just jump straight to the joint actions, right? And then open your books, guys. Like, get your books out and look at, like, you know, reference those muscles. Look at all, you know, if you look at all 4 muscles on a list. Oh, answer that. Where is it? I just opened it. Right? If we look at these muscles here, right? We look at the gastrocnemius, right? If I go to my muscles list, which is in your textbook, I'm going to pull up the thing that I sent you guys, the flashcards, printable thingy. But if we look, it's like, okay, well, I'm looking at the gastrocnemius. So I go to my muscles, the gastrocnemius, right? And I look, and it's like, okay, there it is. Isolated function, accelerates plantar flexion. So which muscle is going to be, you know, that's what it's really good at. So what is that going to limit? What's the opposite of plantar flexion? And there's your answer, dorsiflexion, right? So you can, there's a lot of ways you guys can get the answers to these questions. And it's, you know, you just got to look in your notes, look in your PowerPoint, and read your book. All right, guys.
Question. What part of the book? What chapter?
So it'll be in the biomechanics chapter, or it'll be in the appendix of your textbook. So it'll either be in the chapter that has like the biomechanics, right? So talking about flexion and extension and stuff. And then it'll have a list of all the main muscles, and it'll just be several pages. Or it'll be in the very back of your book in the appendix. And it'll be all the muscles kind of in a couple pages. Should be about, I think it should be about 10 pages.
Gotcha, 10 pages.
I mean, you don't have to read 10 pages. You have to spend, you know, knee and ankle today. Don't get into the hip. Stay away from the shoulder. We'll get those later.
Question. So for homework number 3, it's covering the knee and the what? What area?
It's going to be the first half will be the ankle, and the second half will be the knee. Yep.
Okay, so it's yesterday's and today's coverage. Got it. Okay.
Yeah, we only ever give you like 2 days to review at a time. Otherwise, it's just, you know, it's way too much. All right, guys, lots of questions today. It was a fun lecture. I loved it. All right, I'm gonna let you guys out of here, and I will see you guys on Monday. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Great. Have a great one. Thank you.
Yeah.